In this video, we're investigating the comparison process. You may have already been doing some planning for your comparison, and the purpose of this video is to take you from that planning phase into the actual writing, getting words on the page and constructing a comparative paragraph. This is just one model that I use to help students organise their ideas into the three sections we're going to look at in this video: the assertion level, the technique level, and the evidence level. For the purpose of this video, I'm not going to teach you how to use the planning process. I'm going to use a pre-made piece of planning. And our focus is on how we take this planning information and move into the composition of a piece of writing. One of the most important features to include in a comparison is comparative language. And we look at the quality of a comparison by looking at how much comparative language it uses. Comparison includes both similarities and differences. And we've got some examples here of the type of language we might expect to see when things are being compared. Because we're new to comparison, we're using a relatively simple system to make sure that we're comparing at each level. You don't need to have comparative language in every sentence. We're just going to make sure that at each of the three levels, you have mentioned both texts that you're comparing and you've used comparative language. We're going to jump into the process of writing now. And the starting point for my writing is about my assertions. The first sentence of a comparative paragraph should aim to demonstrate what ideas you're going to be exploring. In this case, my two texts have different ideas. The first text is talking about how compassion can help us overcome feelings of failure, and the second assertion is talking about how mistakes can be condemned by society. The first part of our comparative paragraph is pretty straightforward. All I need to do is make sure that I include those two assertions and that I mention both texts and use comparative language. This is what I've written. Lifted demonstrates how compassion can help us overcome feelings of failure, while the hunt illustrates how mistakes can be condemned by society. I've really just taken the assertions that I had in the planning document and made sure that I've put the title of the text in front of it so you know which one's which. The other key word I've added is the word while, and that's my comparative language. While determines that there are differences in what I'm saying between the two texts. As a quick point of reference, I come back to our criteria. Did I mention both texts at the assertion level? Yes, I said lifted and the hunt, and I talked about how they had different assertions. Did I use comparative language? Yes, because I used the word while to illustrate the fact that there was a difference between those assertions. Ready to move on. For my technique planning, I've assigned a different technique to each theme that I've talked about. So for the first text, a feeling of failure is one of the themes within the story, and compassion is another theme within the story. Now my assertion suggests that compassion helps us overcome feelings of failure. So I need to show how both of these themes are present and how they relate to each other. For each technique, I've listed the theme being communicated, the specific technique used, and the example in the text that I'm going to be referring to. And I'm going to use all of these ingredients to create my technique section of the paragraph. Based on the plan that I just showed you, you should be able to see all of the elements that were in my list have been added into my sentences here. To communicate this assertion, lifted uses the small alien to characterize failure, while featuring the act of handing over the controls of the ship to symbolize compassion. In contrast, mistakes are characterized through the hunt through sire, while the condemnation of those mistakes is symbolized through the knife. What you should be able to see in this case is a clear connection between the assertions that I made in the first sentence and the techniques that I've connected to those assertions in the second section. Just like the first section, I should be able to scan the green section here and identify both texts, so I can see that I've talked about lifted and I've talked about the hunt, and you can also see that I've used the term in contrast, which is my comparative language, showing that the technique used in one text is different from the techniques used in the other text. Notice in this case I've used two sentences, and let me reinforce the fact that I do not have to use a piece of comparative language in every sentence. I use it in every section. With that in mind, if I review the technique level, have I mentioned both texts in the green section? Yes, I did. And have I used comparative language? Yes, I did. Ready to move on. The example section is always going to be the biggest part of your paragraph because this is where you're going to explain where those things that you've pointed out actually happen. My plan has given me some dot points to make sure that I speak to, but I'm going to be putting more detail into my paragraphs than what I've currently got listed. I need to remember that the little alien who characterizes failure fails the test and gets upset. But I'm going to give some more descriptive detail about how I know that the little alien is upset and why that's important. And you'll see that coming out in what we write next. To make things clearer, I've broken my evidence sections into two. One is about lifted and one is about the hunt. The structure of my evidence follows the dot points that I had in my plan. Within lifted, we see the little alien characterizing failure when they repeatedly try to abduct the human being only to fail. The human repeatedly hits the walls and ceiling of their roof rather than going through the window, and even when the small alien appears to be successful, the human is almost killed, requiring the big alien to take over. The small alien is shown to be upset at failing the test with tears streaming down their face. So in this section, I've really addressed that first dot point, which was that the little alien shows failure. In this case, I've demonstrated what they did that made them fail and how we've shown that they were upset about failing by describing the tears streaming down their face. In response to this failure, the big alien offers the steering wheel of the spaceship to symbolize his compassion. The little alien immediately stops crying and enthusiastically pilots the ship. This demonstrates how compassion can allow us to overcome feelings of failure. So you can see in the second part, I've talked about the second dot point that I had down for lifted. I've talked about the fact that in response to feeling upset, the big alien performs an action that symbolizes his compassion. And that links to what I said I was going to prove in my techniques section. Because the little alien stops crying once they're given the steering wheel, that shows that the compassion allowed that little alien to feel better about the fact that he'd failed. And that proves my assertion. You can see that I've taken a similar approach in the second section. In the hunt, Saya characterizes mistakes when she initially misses the shot on her target and later is too slow to respond to Deckard's question in the icy river. So notice how my first question targets what I said. I said that Saya characterizes mistakes. And in this case, I've been specific about what mistakes she makes and why they're a problem. In response to her mistakes, Deckard produces a long knife, which symbolizes the fact that mistakes are not tolerated in their society, and Deckard condemns her for her errors by slicing her neck to remind her of her weakness. In this way, we can see how mistakes are not tolerated in society. Just like I did in the previous section for lifted, I've shown then how the knife is symbolic of that lack of tolerance, the fact that the mistakes are condemned. And you can see the word condemn in my explanation of that. The important thing to take from this example paragraph is that I'm constantly making connections. I'm connecting my assertion to my techniques to my examples. And everything I say that is in this text, I'm specifically explaining. I've deliberately done this in a way that makes sure that my logic is clear and consistent. But there is a little bit of repetition in place. But when you're just learning to do a comparison, this is a really important way to ensure that you're covering all of your content and constantly comparing. If I go back to my final criteria, did I mention both texts? Yes, I did. Even though I had them set up as two separate paragraphs, because we're learning about comparison, I'm more interested in that orange section, which included both texts and their examples. And I use comparative language again by reinforcing the way that the techniques we used was different between lifted and the hunt. That brings us to the end of this video. And if you've been able to follow successfully, you've got most of a comparative paragraph written. There is another section to the paragraph, which is the interpretation, but there's another video that'll give you some tips around that. The important thing to note is that if you've got a clear assertion level, technique level, and content level with consistent comparative language and the mention of both texts, then you've successfully created a comparative structure